But we want to keep the evening moving forward, so I would like to introduce our most distinguished guest, Dr. Philip Clayton. And as you can read in the printed bio that you have in your folders, Dr. Clayton is Provost of Claremont Lincoln University, a multi-religious consortium of schools, and Dean of Claremont School of Theology, a graduate of Yale University and a former professor both in the United States and Europe. He specializes in constructive theology, the religion-science debate, and comparative religious studies. Dr. Clayton has been a leading advocate for the internationalization of the science-religion dialogue and has worked actively to expand support for this field to Muslim and Jewish scholars, to the Dharma traditions of India, and to the religions of Southeast Asia. He has written on a wide variety of topics across the fields of religion and theology, the philosophy of science and neuroscience, philosophy of mind, history of philosophy, philosophy of religion, and constructive metaphysics. He has authored or edited 22 books, most recently Adventures in the Spirit, The Predicament of Belief, Science, Philosophy, Faith, and Religion and Science. He came all the way from Los Angeles, and we are grateful and honored to have him here. Please give him a warm Colorado welcome, Dr. Clayton.
I don't know, that sounds like to me enough to ruin your appetite. I try to say, Steve, stop. Well, you know, one thing we haven't done this evening is to pause and thank the people that paid for the plate. So I think we should just pause and thank Mosaic for putting on a beautiful And so, you know, a dinner talk is the hardest genre ever invented for a public speaker. I spoke to 1,000 United Methodists a couple of weeks ago in Nashville. I thought that was easy by comparison, right? And everyone in the room knew that my theology was wrong. You know, so I've never had 1,000 theologians against me at once. You know, and especially sometimes when in these events where that American Californian red liquid is served, it's easier to get through a dinner talk, and when you look out at a room full of iced tea as a speaker, your stomach just So I'd like to do the impossible and sort of pause in the midst of this headlong rush. I mean, I'm told there are people in the room who are in the middle of a 120-day session, still shy of the midpoint by a week, right? And, you know, and I come from being the executive vice president of a university, you know, where the demands are over the top. And so here's what I want to do. I know I'm wasting my precious 19 and a half minutes. I want to actually pause for a moment, just take a breath and orient, and then I want to ask a hard question of you guys. So let's just pause for a second. So you can break the rush for a moment, and I want to turn the energy in a different direction. I think it's worth pausing to ask, why is it we do what we do? A lot of people in this room work beyond 24/7, what would that be, 25/8 or something, to do it. And what is it that drives us? What are the problems at a deeper level that undercuts the divisions between us, that drives us? And I wanted to frame it as it might seem as in a negative way, by asking about a concern that we see globally, the concern of religious violence or religious conflict. You know, if you ask an American survey show, if you ask an American to complete the phrase religious something, in the first 4 options, the word conflict is added. And by many Americans on first or second place. Religion is identified with a source of global conflict. It seems to me that raises a question for us about the role of religion. Now, I could approach that theologically, talk about, you know, the belief systems and so forth, but we can also ask that question as a political question. So I want to address the question of religious conflict as a civic issue. And the best way to do that is to tell you a story about Denmark. The really nice thing about Denmark is nobody hates the Danes. Right? If you're Danish, nobody hates your foreign policy. And what are you famous for? Dairy products and flowers, tulips. And so the happy-minded Danes, not too many years ago, a little over 10 years, in the Copenhagen newspaper, published a comic strip, a political cartoon, showing the prophet Muhammad. And for a Muslim, that is a form of sacrilege. And the mild-mannered Danes suddenly found there were riots in Nigeria against the Danes. People were burning Danish flags. I don't even know what a Danish flag looks like, And they were pouring Danish milk into, the Persian Gulf. And it basically wasn't going well for the Danes. And the loss was, $9 million a day or something like that. And the Danes had a civic problem on their hand, and they didn't understand it. What happened is the government got directly involved and said, we don't understand what just happened, we want to understand it, and launched a 3-year process of study, small meetings, large conferences, and then in Copenhagen, a huge international conference. I had the chance to give the opening keynote to that address and to talk about a world with highly secular nations and people whose religious motivations get messed up with that. At the end of this 5-day meeting, I could see politicians, academics, and business leaders beginning to understand how to manage Denmark in the context of a religious pluralism that affected their secularity. Needing to think differently about what it is to be a Dane in today's world. I want to suggest that the United States faces a similar question. In fact, don't we actually stand before two major approaches to the question of religious diversity? The one is the model, I win, you lose. The existence of other religious groups stands as a threat to my particular religious identity, and somehow I feel belittles it. It's a zero-sum game. And if my religion thrives, yours has to do less. But if your religion thrives, I've been somehow lessened. And I could give you numerous examples, but you know from the American media, you know from your own districts, what that looks like in practice. I want to suggest that we have another option. And I don't want to argue it out of a religious basis, but rather on a civic basis. I want to argue that it's better for America if we can strengthen each other and strengthen our nation through these religious differences. I actually want to argue this is a requirement for a healthy civic society. This might be an easier case to make in Denver than it was yesterday evening in Cheyenne. It's suddenly strong. I'll let that one stand.
Yeah.
And it's a way in which the world has changed. So I was raised in a small town. When I was interested in religious involvement, I only knew one. There was only one kind of religious community, Christian churches. There was a variety of flavors. It didn't seem to matter much. You would just end up in one of them. My kids and your kids exist in a completely different world. Larger towns, large cities, facing religious diversity every day of their lives. Facing a kind of question that we hadn't confronted before. Now, does this mean we don't get to have a sort of religious home any longer because we're just a pluralistic world and the only possibility is a kind of syncretism? I want to strongly resist that idea. Just as on my street, there's one particular home where my family and I are at home. There's a living room, there's a dining room, a kitchen, a bedroom that represents that place where we live and that nourishes us as a family. And next to us are other families for whom that particular square space has the same connotation. The same thing functions within religious communities. They represent, how can I say it, a moral home. A center that supports values, that calls them beyond themselves in different languages, using different scriptures, using different stories and histories and metaphors and motivating ideas, but the net result is the same. It calls them beyond that natural human tendency towards selfishness and calls them upward to something which is a higher calling. Now, we could speak of that theologically, but let's just speak of it civically. It's a calling toward a living for others and not just oneself. I have a board of the university I serve, which began with 2 Christian, 2 Jewish, and 2 Muslim board members. It's now expanded, but those are my first bosses. And in an early stage of the university, we're having a conversation as friendships began to build. And an elderly Muslim gentleman, actually a famous spokesperson in the United States, looked around the board and he said, you know, I was born a Muslim, I'm going to die a Muslim. I know God through one scripture, one prophet, and one set of practices. This, he said with a pause, almost a break in his voice, he said, this is my limitation. And he said, but I now learned that God doesn't have my limitation. And that God is able to be understood through other scriptures, other prophets, and other sets of practices. I will always live through this one, but I no longer need to say that God can only be understood through this one. I thought that was one of those fantastic moments of transformation. An attitude of our day actually sharpens our individual religious identity and strengthens our particular location. Maybe I could tell a story. I spoke some years ago in Yogyakarta, Indonesia, to scholars from around the world, and I was supposed to talk about Christian identity of the human person. There was a rabbi and there was an imam. I looked out at this audience of about 300 young Muslim students who were waiting to see what this, maybe the first time they'd had a Christian pastor speaker actually come to talk to them. And the trouble was, I was in this period of personal doubt. I wasn't sure about some of the tenets of my faith. You probably no one else in this room has had that period. You know, I just, the things I'd been taught weren't holding. I wasn't really comfortable with that religious identity I'd grown up with. And so I'd written a very neutral talk. You know, Christians are said to believe the following, you know. Yeah. Their scriptures quote as follows. They apparently have a prophet named Jesus. So keeping myself well out of the story. I'm sure it's a disappointment to my host. Right? The rabbi had no such problem, but the Christian speaker was in an agony of doubt. Happens more often than you think. And as I stood up to speak, I realized that I was copping out. That to that room full of 300 young Muslim university students, whatever niceties of doubt I might be carrying, I was an American from a majority Christian nation. I functioned, and I was clearly not Jewish, I was clearly not Muslim, I was a Christian. And it was almost like their eyes said, get over it, speak up, we want to know what you say, we want to know what you think, right? And I stood up and I said, thank you for having me, and I would like to share as a Christian about how we view humankind, the dark sides and the bright sides. I want to share that with you tonight. I later wrote actually an article for the Washington Post about that moment. And I said, in an interesting way, it was Islam that helped me to be a Christian. It was that religious difference that got me out of my picayune doubts and back to saying who it is that I am. Acknowledging I live in that house, I don't live in that one or that one, and I might as well make my peace with that one. Do you understand? Once I realized that crossing religious boundaries actually deepens personal religious identity, I realized we have to find others to engage in this dialogue with. And I began to locate Christian speakers around the country who are engaged in this process. And then it was fairly easy to find Jewish leaders around the United States who are engaged in this process as well, like Rabbi Stephen and the Wisdom House in Denver, which engages in this sort of interfaith dialogue. I had trouble, however, finding Muslim groups in the United States who would engage with us in this new kind of interfaith endeavor. And it was that point that I encountered this Hizmet movement. And we'd like to share just a moment about it as a case study. It's founded by this philosopher, kind of a gentle mystic guy named Fethullah Gulen, who about 30 years ago started preaching in a very secular Turkey that Islam could play a role in helping to establish peace. He had 5 simple principles that he started preaching in that time, and in various books since that time has always repeated. Number 1, violence is never an acceptable option for a Muslim believer. The Quran can never be properly used to justify violence, period. Number 2, dialogue between science and religion, not the rejection of science. Number 3, dialogue between religions. And this is a beautiful quote. Listen, he writes, Islam, Christianity, and Judaism all come from the same root, have almost the same essentials, and are nourished from the same source. Although they have lived as rival religions for centuries, the common points between them and their shared responsibility to build a happy world for all the creatures of God make interfaith dialogue among them necessary. Now, I'd like to see my co-religionists rise to that level of insight. Dialogue between the religions, peace building through education, and 5th, a multi-party democracy for a healthy civil society. Tonight's talk is about the civic side, and when I saw a Muslim leader recognizing the preconditions for a healthy civic society, I realized I'd found the discussion partner. You know, Hizmet means service, and I started, as I researched it, I found out that planefuls of support had gone to Darfur in Somalia, paid for by businessmen who were influenced by Fethullah Gulen. The first airplane to land in Japan with emergency supplies after the tsunami was sent by people inspired by the teachings of Mr. Gulen. The formation of schools is often in the most conflict-ridden areas, where the idea is that through education, you can help people to pull out of conflict and begin to learn how to live with each other. If that isn't a part of our American ethos, I don't know what is. I had, like some others in this room, I had the chance to go to Turkey and to observe some of this in practice. Diversity at the universities, businessmen who were working in the civic society to bring about support. Really an inspiration. We were talking about that dinner, an inspiration for a lot of us. But let me just tell you, the most moving and frightening moment was I was invited to go to a place called Academy, which is where imams are trained. And I have to admit that as a person with a fairly strong Christian religious identity, I was a little frightened. I was going into, a place where people study Quran and would be future imams, and I admit, some stereotypes into that. This was a place, again, affiliated with this movement by Mr. Gulen. And that was the most amazing moment of this entire trip. I presented the things that I believed, and we began with about 50 of these students, these future imams, and we began in a process of dialogue. And what I found was mutual respect, their ability to honor the prophet that I follow, and to feel no need to sort of challenge or push back against that. I mean, you guys, it wasn't as if we didn't know that we held different beliefs. They were theologians, I'm a theologian. We recognized sharply different beliefs, but we recognized we could stand together on a basis of peace. We could speak of the one God and the prophets who help us understand the nature of God. I have to say that was the most life-changing moment of the trip to Turkey, is the sense of this contrast. It can't be a coincidence that the most moderate movement in Islam globally had its origins in Turkey. Turkey is, after all, this place of particular geopolitical significance because it's poised between an increasingly secular Europe and, in many ways, a radicalized Middle East, where we see the most extreme versions of Islam. And Turkey stands there, a secular, multi-party democracy with one eye turned toward Europe and America, and as a 98% Muslim population, another part turned toward the Middle East. It seems to represent a third way, a middle way, between the radical secularism and the radical fundamentalism. You guys, that doesn't just happen. That has to be created by intellectuals, by religious leaders, by philosophers, by business leaders. It doesn't just arise out of nothing. It strikes me as no coincidence that this movement was born in Turkey. Let me close. The Gulen movement was for me an interesting case study because it helped break through a variety of stereotypes that I held. It helped me learn about the other side of Islam, the side that doesn't get covered in our media very often. I mean, what is the core teaching of Islam? God is compassionate. We should love our neighbor. Muhammad said, and see if you can hear any overtone, those of you who know the Christian scriptures. He said, none truly believe in not just toleration, but friendships, day by day, in the classroom, as we eat together, as we work together on this campus. But the telos, the goal of the whole process, has to be to make a difference in the world. In the end, it's about what the religions do for our society and for the world when we begin to partner in this way. That means working with businessmen, with nonprofits and NGOs, with community service organizations, with educational organizations, in our local community, nationally and internationally. And what I would like to hold up as I close is the ideal that conversations like tonight, conversations like these organizations listed behind me, conversations like what we're doing at Claremont Lincoln University, have to have the goal, not just that we tolerate each other, or that we're able to talk from time to time, but that we actually hold hands to go out there and make a difference. If this evening is more than symbolic significance, if it's a step towards something that our country needs, it's because we're building partnerships that we're going to use not just once a year, but day by day, week by week, month by month. Thanks so much for letting me share this thought.